Morning, this is Linda from Sunday Best Quilt Works. We want to talk about the new Lucky 7 for 2020. We're trying something different this year. We're not going to do a little pieced nibbly block. We're going to do some Hawaiian Appliqué. If you haven't done applique before, you're going to love this. There are several different techniques you can use to accomplish your block. You can do satin stitch on your sewing machine, blanket stitch either by hand or on your sewing machine. You can do raw edge applique, and you can finally do it by hand if you're brave and love it like I do. Each month you're going to receive 1/4 of your pattern. It's going to look like this when you get it, and you're going to need to trim your pattern down so that this line disappears and you're able to find the center of your pattern for tracing. The patterns are not going to be a consistent size, so you can't cut all of your fusible at one time. We want to measure the design. If you're doing the entire design in one fabric, you would put your ruler to the top and you'd need to cut your background fusible. 6 times 6 would be 12, so you would need a sheet 12 by 12. This one is not quite as big. It comes out, the top of your design comes out to be about 5.5. So you would need a piece of fusible, a square that's roughly 11 to 12 inches, so you have enough to make it work. You're going to take a piece of fusible that's cut to size. We're going to draw a quadrant to divide the lines, and then you will lay your design underneath one quadrant, center it on your design, and trace. And then you're ready to flip and trace the next quadrant and work your way around. This will give you your fusible all in one section. If you're using a block like this, you can choose to make your flower part of the unit and have all in one color, or you can choose to make your flower a different color, as I've done here. Your pattern will indicate whether it goes over the top of the stem or underneath the stem. You'll encounter some that are done both ways as we're progressing. So once you get your design drawn out, we're ready to fuse it to your fat quarter. I cut my fat quarters to a consistent size of 15.5 inches square. So if we fuse this to our fabric, it's going to have a little bit of stiffness because of the fusible behind it. You can use a technique called window painting, where you can come in, cut away some of the bulk from the inside. I save the scraps to use for something else down the road. When you're doing preparation for hand applique, it's going to be a little bit different than when we prepared it for the heat and bond method or the fusible method. I've got 1/4 of my design drawn here. I've measured my design and determined the size of the square of freezer paper that I need, and I've got it creased. This time I do not have to draw every quadrant. When we're working by hand, we're going to be working on the exact cut line. So this is a Baltimore album technique that we're going to use for the Hawaiian Appliqué to make it really quick and easy. So I'm going to fold it back onto the pre-folded lines that I used for tracing. I'm going to drop a few staples in. And now I'm ready to get my Karen K. Buckley scissors that cut to the point. And I'm going to cut all 4 quadrants at one time. Now I'm going to warn you, do not try this with your fusible. It seemed like such a good idea that I tried it. Unfortunately, the sticky bits of the fusible came off of the background paper and it made a huge mess. It didn't work for that technique, so for that one, on the fusible, we have to trace each and every quadrant. But this makes it much simpler for hand applique, that after you cut the entire design out, you come back with a staple puller, pull out the parts and pieces, and you can unfold a design that's already cut out and perfect and ready to iron to the top side of your focus fabric for the center of your block. I've taken my focus fabric and I've ironed it into 4 quadrants. I'm going to open it up At this time, I'm lining up my freezer paper onto the fold lines with the corner units pointing towards the corners. I'm going to start in the middle so that my sticky gets us stabilized right there. You can see that the shiny side of the freezer paper sticks really, really well. It also comes off really, really well. So when you're doing a one-piece applique like this, it's the perfect way to get there. Now that we have our design cut out and our freezer paper is stuck to the background, we're going to come in, and I'm using a Frixion fine point pen because I want a very fine line to show around each one of these little bits of freezer paper. This way we're going to get a perfectly accurate quadrant. Each one's going to look exactly alike. So I want a fine line so that when I do needle turn applique, it disappears. If you don't get the entire line turned under, using the Frixion pen is wonderful because it will go away with heat. Now you'll notice that I've got a little sandpaper board underneath. I found that when I trace my applique, this stabilizes it and keeps everything from slipping, and it's a really neat little thing. If you haven't tried one before, it works really, really well. If you have a dark fabric that you're using for your top, a Roxanne pencil works great, and a Soline white pencil works great. That way you can see your marks on a dark background. When we cut out one for hand applique, we're going to go just about 1/8 of an inch outside of the design so that we have enough to turn under, but we don't want a wide turn under margin because that makes it look padded. One of the things that's helpful is to come into your points and make a clip all the way down to the point, and as we turn it under, that lets you turn under to get a really sharp, clean point. Once we get to hand applique, we're ready to put our trimmed design on our block. I don't know if you can see it, but I've used a rough basting stitch coming inside my design here, and I based with enough margin away from the edge so that when I turn this under, it won't get in the way. Needle turn applique is really neat. Our goal is to make our stitches disappear as best we possibly can, and I'm going to show you how we accomplish that. You want a really fine needle. My preferred is the Peacemaker's number 12. It's a shorter needle. I've had some people who have a little trouble holding the shorter needle, so the Richard Hemmings needle is also very fine. It's a size 11. They both glide through the fabric easily and are wonderful to use. I like to use silk thread, and I own quite a bit of it. I'm working on this one with silk thread because I had a color that matches. We've also discovered that we have real good success doing hand applique with bottom line thread. It's very fine. And so we ordered in some bobbins that are wound with colored bottom line thread. We didn't order it in to sell as bobbins. We ordered it in so that it gives you an assortment for your hand applique without having a huge investment like I had in my silk thread. If you've never used a needle threader before, these are absolutely fabulous, these little clover needle threaders. You're going to put your needle in, eye down, in that little hole right there. You're going to put your thread in and snug it up towards the little handle, and then you pop the handle, and it comes out with a perfect little loop, and now you can pull your thread right through. It's best to pull one strand at the time so you don't go ahead and undo your needle. And then I do just an old-fashioned knot like my grandmother taught me. I wet my finger, roll it around, and that's going to be on the back of your block, so the knot doesn't make any difference at all. All right, I'm starting where I left off, pulling my knot up. I'm going to use the side of my needle. We got a narrow edge here, and we don't want to fray that, so I'm going to reach slightly ahead, hold it with my thumb, and use the side of my needle to sweep it back on the drawn line. The drawn line disappears. we're on an inside point and we're going to be stitching out. My goal is to take small stitches. My needle is going to go directly under the area where my thread came out, and I want to try to get in that rolled up bottom of the outside edge. I'm going to do one stitch at the time, because if you try to load your needle and take multiple stitches, you wind up with knots in your thread. Okay, so I'm shooting for the bottom of that tiny little rolled edge. I'm putting my needle directly under the stitch I took. I'm coming up in the bottom, I am coming up in the bottom of the outside rolled edge there and pulling it through one tiny little stitch at the time. And I will take my needle and push it ahead of me as I work my way toward the tip. I want to show you how we're going to handle the fullness at a tip. Reaching under, reaching forward in the outside rolled edge, and now I'm coming to my drawn point. It's going to take about 2 more stitches to actually get there. 1, 2. Now I want to come up on my drawn line, and here I'm going to make 2 stitches on the outside edge, so that when I push the point underneath, it gives me something solid to push against. Now if you'll notice, there's this tiny little flag of fabric sticking out there. It doesn't look like much, but if I try to shove it under, it's going to get in the way. So I'm going to reach in and just clip away that little wedge. Now I'm going to take the needle, catch the outside fold, and turn it. And you literally just turn your needle, your hand, and again you push it away like this, and I've got a tad bit of fray right there. Let me get that tucked underneath. Always use the side of your needle and not the point. The side pushes those feathery edges in. The point tends to fray them and make them even worse. And so we're coming out and we're working our way towards an inside point. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead so you don't have to watch me just stitch and stitch. With an inside point, I've made a small clip that goes almost to the drawn line. I'm going to use the tip of my needle to pull it under, and I'm going to stitch as close to that indentation as I can. Okay. This is the one place in a block where I don't care if my stitch shows. I want to lock that little point now. I'm going to take 2 stitches, one on top of the other, to secure the folds in that point. I'm going to take the side of my needle, put the tip in, catch the fabric, push it under. Now with those 2 stitches, again, it gives me something to push against. I'm going to start back with my needle on the top side of the fabric and come back out on that folded edge, and that gives you a very graceful outside point here and a very graceful inside point here. And it can sometimes be a little difficult to see what you're doing. So beside my chair in the living room, I have the magnifying light by Mighty Bright. It makes things huge. We're giants for trying to do this kind of tiny little work, and having the magnifying light really puts it up and lets you see exactly what you're doing. You can see every individual thread. If we are stitching by machine, there are several different ways to get there. You can choose to do the simplest, which is a straight stitch, raw edge applique. You use a matching thread that's fine. You stitch with a small, tight, straight stitch around your raw edges. And because batiks are so tightly woven, they rarely fray. Another method, my favorite, is satin stitch applique. I'm going to be showing you how to achieve nice points for beginners on my sample here. And on this one, I used a machine. It's a mimic of a blanket stitch. My machine doesn't actually have a blanket stitch, so that I was able to modify a hem stitch, and I get a really neat and nice look. For any of our applique projects, we're going to want to put a stabilizer of some sort on the back. I have used packing paper here. You can use lightweight magazine paper. Never copy paper because it's too hard to rip off and it can damage your stitches. Or if you want to have it completely go away, you can use wash and gone stabilizer on the back. I pin my paper stabilizer or whatever I'm using to the back of my block, and that allows me to have more control. For all types of our machine applique, the first thing we're going to have to do is tighten up our stitch length to almost 0 and make 2 or 3 really tight stitches to lock our threads. We will begin and end with a tight lock stitch on each method. For satin stitch, I used to match my bobbin thread to whatever I was doing on top in order to prevent pokies or little bits of the bobbin thread coming up and showing. Now I use a finer weight bottom line thread, and I can change from one color to another. I don't have to worry about it showing through on top, and I find that really helpful. So I've made my locking stitch. I'm switching to my satin stitch, and I want it to be fairly narrow. I don't want to wrap a lot of thread around my block. If I don't like the way my threads are laying, I'm going to tighten up my stitch length until the threads lay just about side by side. You'll notice that I'm using mostly my left hand to control it. With the paper or other stabilizer on the back, I find that I can just sort of roll the design in toward my needle. And as I get to this point, I'm going to take 1 or 2 stitches, completely cover the end. Now I'm going to lift my needle, slightly reposition until I'm touching the bottom of those stitches that I just did. I'm going to do something very similar here at this corner. I made 1 or 2 stitches past the corner. I'm going to realign, line up with my needle on the outside of the applique right here, and resume stitching. That keeps your threads from piling up on top of each other and gives you a sharper, cleaner, crisper point. Now, a lot of applique people narrow their stitch as they reach the point, and I've done that in the past, but since this may be your first attempt at machine applique, what we're doing is just showing you the quickest and easiest way to get a very respectable looking point and a very respectable looking inside point. So again, I take a couple of stitches past my unit, my point, I line up with my needle on the outside, and each and every time I want the needle to be falling just on the outside and the bulk of my thread going to the left-hand side to cover the fabric as much as possible. Take 1 more stitch, swing it around. With the paper underneath and everything stabilized, it works really, really well because you can just turn it. The reason I want the paper on the back, your stitches, if they're tight, have a tendency to buckle your fabric just a little bit and crease it, and it causes your block not to lay as flat after the work is completed. And when you do it this way with a stabilizer on the bottom, you're set to go. If it tends to pucker a little bit, you just add another layer of paper, and it works every time. And when it comes time to take it off, it rips off very, very easily with no residue, and it works. For me, it's the way I've been doing applique for 20 years.